Good afternoon, and welcome to today's launch event on investing in Europe's cross-border electricity infrastructure. This discussion is part of CERRE's work on the right policies and regulatory frameworks for a secure and affordable energy transition. Most recently, we've put out a study that highlights the role of flexibility. That is, all the technologies and mechanisms that allow us to fully integrate renewables and to avoid curtailment, to reduce price volatility across borders, and to keep the system stable and overall cost-effective. Delivering flexibility at scale depends, of course, very fundamentally on a well-integrated European grid with sufficient interconnectors between the member states and their neighbors. And recent and not so recent blackout events have shown over and over again how important cross-border connections are in providing grid stability, preventing regional events from spreading, but also helping to restore the system after the event. So it's a very timely discussion to have. And without this infrastructure, we risk higher system costs, we risk to underuse clean energy and a less resilient grid. So today we will look closer at why it's so hard to deliver on interconnector projects. The challenges are, of course, not only technical, they involve questions of risk, they involve questions of costs and benefits allocation and cross-border governance. And we have an interdisciplinary team here at CERRE who've been looking into these questions over the past month. They combine legal, economic, and engineering expertise, and they've reviewed the existing frameworks. They've gathered insights from across Europe and have spoken to a number of stakeholders, talking about regulators, TSOs, policymakers, and utilities that we are grateful to have with us today. And I would like to first now invite our lead author, Professor Bert Willems from the University of Louvain, and his co-author, Dr. Christine Brandstätt from the Copenhagen School of Energy Infrastructure, to share their findings. Welcome, and please, Bert, Christine, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Annika. So I think we can go directly ahead with the presentation. So we'll kick off with a short highlight of the report, and then we can go for the panel discussion. So the topic of the project is the cross-border cost allocation for electricity transmission networks. And we were lucky to have a very good team to work on this. So I'm Bert Willems from UC Louvain, the French-speaking Leuven University in Belgium. So I'm an economist, but I was lucky to work with a number of very good co-authors. So we have Chloé Lecoq, also an economist from Paris. She's a CERRE member and a fellow, and she has done quite a lot of studies. For instance, the flexibility study she was also involved there. Then we have Cecile Nieuwenhout. So she's a lawyer from the Groningen Center for Energy Law and Sustainability, and she's an expert in offshore wind regulation, energy regulation. So she's very good in mixing different fields of legal expertise. Then we have also engineer Floor Serine. So she is a PhD student at the KU Leuven and UC Catholique de Louvain. So she is crossing the language border, and she's really specializing in those cost allocations, both the economics and the technical aspects of the networks. And then the one person that I haven't mentioned yet is Christine Brandstätt. So she's here also in the call. So she is at the Copenhagen School of Energy Infrastructure. So she does both the business side, policy, and economics, and I'm very happy to have everybody involved. And of course, we also had the support from the back office at CERRE with Annika and Julia, who has done a lot of work in managing the whole project and cleaning up some of the text, but also reaching out to all the stakeholders and making sure that what we say also is connected with what the stakeholders want. So Christine, I will give the floor or the microphone to you, so you can go to the next slide maybe.
Yes, thank you, Bert, for the nice introduction and for the opportunity to participate in the study and also to speak today. I'm going to kick off the academic presentation with a brief overview of how come we did this study. Maybe if we can move to the scope. Yes, so the scope of the study. When we set out for this project, we were looking at the increasing challenge in Europe to get more electricity interconnections in place. On the one hand, it is sort of common knowledge that we need more interconnection and also more multilateral projects, which sort of incorporate benefits not just for the two neighboring countries interconnecting, but will benefit a larger subset of European member states and sort of be more intricate in the European energy system. And also increasingly, we're talking about hybrid projects, so projects that will not only be interconnectors. For example, in the offshore realm, we have projects where the interconnector sort of from the beginning thought together with the generators that are also connected in that space. So we could have an interconnector offshore that also serves as a connection point for offshore plants, and all of those additional dimensions don't make it that much easier to get the interconnection implemented. So now we have this large debate about cost benefit sharing, on the one hand, as the cost of just ever increasing interconnection increases, but also as the benefits become more varied and more diffuse. And as if that wasn't enough of a challenge already, there's also the question of how to integrate these new frameworks into legal processes and just in general the framework and the processes that are in place already. So in this space, we found it a very interesting discussion, a very challenging one to contribute to as well. But now we believe we contribute in at least 4 areas. So on the one hand, we reviewed the existing regulation on cross-border allocation. We're going to get to that in a second. So we really look at what frameworks are in place already, not just for the initial allocation of cost, but also subsequent settlements, which will affect who benefits and who bears cost of increasing interconnection. The report also provides an analytical framework to compare different cost-sharing rules in a very formal economics manner. On the one hand, we're really exploring and sort of structuring the trade effects and who benefits from different from an interconnector setup under which circumstances, but then also formally how to share those benefits from an economic perspective properly. And then to complement this very theoretical side, we're also looking at real-world example cases, so cases where within Europe interconnection projects have been realized and different approaches of how the cost and the benefits have been split in real projects, focusing, of course, on those that offer at least some interesting input to the discussion. And based on those 3 pillars, if you want, we then come up with policy recommendations in these 4 realms that we outlined here. On the one hand, regarding the governance of interconnections. On the other hand, also just regarding the network planning processes. There's also a part on risk allocation and how to properly allocate the risks that are linked to these interconnection processes. And lastly, an aspect that's also very prominent in the discussion, the financing, especially the question whether this should be financed just based on the domestic rate basis or what role European funding can play there as well. And with this outline, let me jump into this first part. The review of the existing cases, if I can have the next slide up. Oh, I forgot about this one. I'm very sorry. So lastly, I should also mention that this work links to or sort of builds upon and is related to 2 other CERRE reports, in case you're interested in previous works. On the one hand, there's one on scaling offshore wind and another one on flexible regulation, which have been done in 2003 and 2004. They focus on slightly different things, but if you really want to get the whole picture of this issue, then it can be interesting to refer back to those as well. And now we're actually getting to the challenges. And can I get yes, exactly. So here we have these these first 3 parts of the report summed up, because in this presentation we want to focus mostly on the recommendations. So on the one hand, as I said, we've reviewed existing regulation and governance, and that concerns on the one hand the 10-year network development plan, where the system needs for interconnection are identified, and upon which also the initial cost benefit analysis that builds or is a essential part to any kind of negotiation where this is done. So we review what's done there. And we come to the conclusion that there are some parts in this framework which, of course, can still be improved. And we also acknowledge that TSOs are actually improving this process continuously. But especially, and we're going to get to that in the recommendations regarding the scenarios and discrepancies between the national planning and the European planning, there are some things that seem more urgent than others in this topic of interconnections. There's some uncertainty as to who benefits regarding congestion incomes. There's also, which of course are a mechanism that allocates or reallocates benefits and costs after the fact, so after the infrastructure has been built. So the rule or the split by which congestion income is split for these interconnectors will have an effect on parties' willingness to engage in an interconnector project initially. There's also a European framework on capacity targets, where a minimum of 70% of capacity has to be available for cross-border flows at all times. So if there are problems with congestion or with the reorganization of flows and prices when interconnection projects are implemented, this target will, of course, be kept in mind by the parties who decide whether they want to engage in an interconnection project at a certain cost-benefit split or not. There's also a very, well, maybe unfortunate mechanism of inter-TSO compensation in place, where technically we should be compensating investments that are necessary for cross-border flows and also the losses that are connected with them. Part of that is capped, so it doesn't really scale or reflect what effects this has on the system. And on the other hand, the losses part, which is not capped, seems to be very tedious and very controversial to calculate every year. And then lastly, we also have a framework of network tariffs, which has an influence insofar as network tariffs, especially for generation, can be different in the different member states that are interconnected. So potentially also that can result in some kind of transfer across borders. After reviewing all of that, as I said, we also provide some analytical framework. On the one hand, on the strategic trade effects from increasing interconnection, and on the other hand, on the cost sharing mechanisms that may correct this distortions from distortions or just distributive effects from these interconnections. We look at proportional allocation or allocations according to net benefits and some other more technical things. And then for the real world cases, we observe that most of the interconnection projects so far are just, the cost is just shared according to very simple splits. For example, a 50-50 or a territorial principle, which of course it seems very practical, but it doesn't necessarily reflect who benefits to what extent and what costs can be justified. So we also find but few cases where a more benefit-based sharing has been applied. We also see some example for cost-benefit sharing agreement where some additional EU funding has been taken into account from the beginning, so the cost sharing is just contingent on additional allocations there. And this we find promising examples that more complex cases are possible in line with what we find in the analytical framework. And with this, maybe we can move on to the actual recommendations now. The first one is about rethinking the governance of interconnection processes. So it seems that the current framework, and this is historically probably justified, fits well and works well for, or mostly works well for bilateral projects, where you really can pin both the cost and the benefits down between the two parties involved. But for these more multilateral projects, which have their effects more deeper in the energy system, with more parties benefiting from them, and also more forward-looking projects where it's more uncertain how exactly the assets will be used and how exactly the system will develop, we find some challenges. On the one hand, it's hard to quantify some of the benefits, such as, for example, security of supply. It might be very straightforward to engage in an interconnector project to increase security of supply, but then how much do you actually benefit from that, and what cost are you willing to bear because of that benefit? This is a question that's very difficult to answer. And then also, because these both the projects and also the benefits are forward-looking, there is some kind of dependency on future national energy mixes, and also some demand-side aspects such as industrial electrification. So on the one hand, to deal with the multilateral aspect of this, it seems straightforward to strengthen regional governance. We already have, of course, a very strong governance at the local domestic level, and then we have an overall European layer with the overall European planning. But for some of these projects, it seems feasible and promising to have a more regional level in between, where those countries who are immediately affected, who will immediately benefit, but not just the two initial countries, can be involved and plan together, maybe also together with all the regional countries, but also maybe different projects in that same region together as a package. And then there's also a push or some support to reform regulation to support the member states' cooperation. On the one hand, there is a very simple legal requirement to allow TSOs. Some things that could be relevant in this space, co-ownership of cross-border assets, which currently still seem to be an issue. There's also the idea that some of the activities in more multilateral or hybrid projects could be unregulated, or at least not covered under the standard regulation, where that is justified. And also there's apparently a need for more long-term financial transmission corridors, where we can look beyond the 2-year planning cycle that we currently have. And with this, I'm going to hand over to Bert, who's going to walk us through the remaining recommendations.
Okay, thank you. So so thanks. So we need a more framework where we have more reliable network planning. So this basically means that TSOs, they need to be certain about the generation and demand in neighboring countries, because otherwise it might be very hard to plan your investments. And if there's a lot of uncertainty, we could actually end up with hold-up that one country is not going to invest because they're afraid that another country is going to change their energy policy ex post, and then the investment would not be useful. So we might end up with a system where we are going to wait and nothing is going to happen. So this is not what we want. So what we're suggesting, that it might be useful that countries have some commitment power in their energy mix. I mean, I think that's what you hear also from many investors. On the energy side, they want to be sure about the future as far as the energy policy or the government's policy concerns. But it's also the case for TSO. So we want to have some lock-in of national energy and grid scenarios. And this will mean that grid infrastructure can align with political expectation, because the grid needs to be conform with what we actually want, what the politicians want. And then we also want to make sure that those national plans actually align with the EU targets. So at the moment, there might still be some small discrepancies where national plans, when you all put them together, that they don't yet really satisfy the EU targets. So we want to have this lock-in, but it doesn't mean that we want someone, the EU is going to impose things on member states, because there is still sovereignty on the energy mix. So what we would like to propose is that there is sort of voluntary agreement by member states, let's say in a regional system, where they're going to agree on some energy mix and make hard commitments. So the next slide, please. So in the next slide, we are thinking about different types of tools in which we can actually make those commitments a bit harder. So the first one would be a compensation mechanism, where deviating countries have to compensate TSOs or maybe the other member states if they deviate from intended plans. So that would be more like a contract that's really designed for this compensation. Another thing, what we are thinking about is long-term financial transmission rights. So those are more like private contracts, where one member state could buy a financial transmission right from another TSO, or like buy a corridor to access offshore wind. And this has the advantage that the TSO is going to trade in a variable congestion rent on this connection, and in return it's going to get some predictable money flow from the financial transmission rights. So this means that the TSO is no longer exposed to this risk for changing policy mixes or energy mixes, and this means that the hold-up problem is reduced, and it also has then higher incentives to actually build the transmission line. So we have to be careful if we define this financial transmission rights that we don't end up with hold-up problems. So the EU has always been a bit hesitant to think about those long-term transmission rights. So we think in this case, this is maybe not too bad, because the counterparty of those financial transmission rights, that would be the government. So it would not be private parties that could use those rights to keep competitors out. We also want those financial transmission rights to be financial. So this means that they cannot be used to withhold capacity and to distort competition. And then we could imagine that there's also a secondary market, that the government buys long-term financial transmission rights maybe for 15 years, but then 1 year before they expire, they might sell them on a secondary market and say, okay, now we open up the market. Everybody who wants to use those financial transmission rights cannot buy them back from the government. So this might actually increase some liquidity back into the market if the government would resell those financial transmission rights. Next slide, please. So we also have been looking at the allocation of risks, benefits, and costs on those transmission lines. And what we show in the theoretical framework is that as the network is going to evolve further, and we are going to get a better integration between member states, that we expect that there are going to be asymmetric benefits from cross-border projects. So this depends on what kind of supply you have. You could imagine that you have a very flexible, a lot of renewable energy that could come from the Scandinavian countries. And depending on different supply elasticities, it might be that the benefits of those transmission lines is not going to be 50-50, but that one country might benefit more than the other country. So what we're suggesting is that we deviate from the standard 50-50 sharing rules, and that we are going to adjust the sharing rules based on the projected benefits that countries are going to get. And what we also show in the framework is that the congestion rents and the investment costs should be split in the same way. So if one country is going to pay 80% of the investment cost, then they should also receive 80% of the congestion rents. If you don't do this, then risk and rewards are not aligned, and then you can end up again with hold up. Another topic that we looked at is the use of transmission tariffs, whether we could use this to shift some of the costs to foreign consumers. So TSOs might say, okay, we don't want to pay for this increase in investment, and we can shift the cost to foreign consumers by introducing energy-based injection charges. So we are against this because they're going to distort competition. They're going to be inefficient. So we would like to have this adjustment of the initial investment cost 20-80, 50-50. That should be the method to reallocate cost. We shouldn't be doing this by using some energy tariffs. So what we see though is that we might want to have locational signals, because there's going to be, we expect more congestion on the network. Most TSOs, they have a huge need for new transmission. And if we want to coordinate the location of generation and where we're going to build transmission, TSOs need to have tools to actually steer the location of the generation. And that they can do, okay, they could create smaller bidding zones, but if they don't do this, then one option is to use capacity-based tariffs. And the advantage of those is that it's not going to distort competition, but it's going to give signals for where it's useful to build and which locations are not that good, because maybe there needs to be more upgrades in the network, so then the capacity tariff might be higher. So what we also see that those capacity-based tariffs, they might lead to some competition between member states on where generators are going to build. So if we want to avoid this kind of distortion on location, we might have to think about some EU-level harmonization such that the transmission capacity tariffs are going to reflect the full network cost and not only the national network cost. So let's say if you have building a wind farm in one location is going to create extra cost in a neighboring country, then maybe the capacity tariff should reflect this. But we believe that this is going to be a very long shot, so we don't expect this to happen very soon, that there's this level of harmonization. And it's also the case that we have other types of regulation that still distort competition, maybe the type of permits that you have or the type of subsidy support schemes that you have. So you need to start harmonizing a lot more. So that's why we call this a long shot. And yeah, we say that's something that we need to take into account, but yeah, we are not yet there. Okay, next slide. So another part of the last part of the recommendation is to look at financial support. So we think that the existing CFE mandate might be increased, because we expect that type of benefits that are hard to quantify and that are going to generate EU-wide benefits is likely to going to increase. So security of supply, resilience, or energy independence is becoming more and more important. So we think that those public goods aspects are becoming more important, and that's something that maybe we should subsidize at a European level. We think that we maybe want to delegate this to regional entities if there are really regional public goods that are being created. So maybe we don't want to do this at the EU level, but we also don't want to have different levels where one project has to apply both at EU level and at the regional level. We don't think that it's going to work. So we need to have one location where those funding can be asked for. And then one idea that we have is contract for difference for transmission as a possible mechanism. So we see there's a whole discussion now at EU level for introducing contract for differences for generation. We could imagine that also those contracts for difference could be used for transmission. And those type of contracts are going to be similar to long-term financial transmission rights, but now they have to be linked more closely to transmission assets. So it means that the contract really has to deal with a specific transmission asset, while long-term financial transmission right is often point-to-point injection in one node, taking off energy in another node. It might be better for funding that this is going to be linked to a transmission asset, and this will also then allow TSOs to get funding from banks if they really can say there is another contract that's going to provide funding for this specific assets. In contrast, for contract for differences for energy, those are being allocated by auctions. So basically, you have a lot of possible producers or investors that can compete in those kind of contract for difference. In this case, we're going to get a regulated market where the TSO is going to sell contract for differences. So it's less likely that we're going to get a lot of auctions unless we go for some investors, and we're going to create competition between investors in merchant projects. But we think that most of those new investments are still going to be built by TSOs. So this needs to be a sort of a regulated contract for differences. Next slide, but this might be the last one actually. Okay, so I will hand it over back to Annika, I think.
Yes, thank you very much, Bert. Thank you, Christine. And really first of all, congratulations on the study, and thank you for all the many ideas you bring in here. I think and I hope it's very useful also for the Commission in view of the grid package that's coming out this year. I think all boils down to two main challenges here, which you find really well described in the study. One is, of course, how do we get this whole question financed? There's a lot of unnecessary build out of the grids, and how do you manage the risk? And how do you deal with the question of winners and losers around cross-border grid infrastructure? So thank you for the moment. I will come back to you, Bert and Christine. I would now like to turn to our panelists and also tell our audience that you can react to the panel and to the study in the Q&A, under the Q&A button, and share your questions, and we will pick up on it. Let me welcome our panelists and first turn to Bruno Tobback. Are you here? Hello, Bruno. So you're a member of European Parliament and a member of the Industry, Research and Energy Committee. And you are also the shadow rapporteur of an initiative report on grids that was adopted last week. And so you have had a lot of thinking lately on grids and also on interconnectors. So I would like to invite you to share your insights and also how the report resonates with you.
Thank you very much, Annika. Well, as you said, we have just voted actually last week the initiative report on the grids. One of the things that is nice to note is that there was a very broad consensus and broad coalition on it, which is rare these days in the European Parliament. But is also good news when it comes to seeing that the sense of urgency is sufficiently big around the topic. I want to pick up on one thing that Bert said, which was that the grid needs to align with what politicians want. I've noted it down, so I'm looking at my little notebook here. I think that lays the finger on one big issue, that is that in not all cases do politicians these days know what they actually want. Because the landscape that we are faced with is that what happened in 2022 with the Russian invasion in Ukraine and the spike in gas prices, energy prices in general, has accelerated the desire for transition. But at the same time, it has not exactly accelerated our capacity to do it. And so I think there's a risk of some hesitation right now in how fast can we go with electrification, who can go fastest, and how do we align the investments that we need to do, and that will by necessity be gradual, if only because we have limited capacity to do them. How do we align them with the targets that we need to reach long term? As you probably aware, there's also a not unimportant discussion going on about the European climate targets. So it's not always clear what politicians want these days. It's very clear what I want. I think we need to go as fast as possible with electrification, and that grids are the basis for, if we want to go into AI, if we want to go into industrial electrification, if we want to go in electrical mobility. None of that is possible without the huge investment in electricity grids in Europe. The two main things that I would say that come out of the report is that, one, we need more top-down planning in general, not just on the interconnectors, but in general we need a lot more alignment between the TSO planning and the 10-year development plans on the one hand, and the real-life electrification going on when it comes to production, when it comes to renewables. There's still a huge gap between, on the one hand, the 10-year development programs, and on the other hand, the renewable energy ambitions. We're going to be building a lot of, and it's easy and it's cheap, to build renewable electricity production these days, but we're going to build a lot of it that is not connected to the grid, and which is therefore not usable and not beneficial if we don't accelerate our grid investments. And not just top-down planning when it comes to the interconnections, but also a much more vertical integration from TSO to DSO. Because both of them are essential, important. The one thing that I think is a big step in the report, and it is an initiative report, so it's not direct legislation, but the call to the Commission to go for mandatory interconnection targets, I think is essential. Right now we have interconnection ambitions and targets, which in most cases we don't reach. Spain is a perfect example of that, where I think the actual interconnection rate is about somewhere between 3 and 4%, whereas the ambition is 15%. So we need to have that mandatory. We need to have an instrument to put pressure on the TSOs and the member states to do that. Also to create the visibility through the value chain. And I very much welcome the report in examining ways to better organize the financing around them. We can have a discussion later on whether we go for the net benefits or we go for European funding. I think one of the things that could help for European-based funding is that we do call for a much stronger electrification and grid chapter within the Connecting Europe facility. I think it is not focused enough right now on grid financing, and we are very much looking for instruments and methodologies that could make it possible to put that into use. And so I very much welcome the report on that, and I hope we can have a good discussion on how exactly can we put that into practice.
Super. Thank you very much, Bruno. And I see there is a lot of political will and also consensus and interesting points on top-down planning, not what you usually hear these days, and mandatory interconnection targets. So maybe we pick up on this in the discussion. I would like to next turn to François Baud. You work with ACER, and ACER is, of course, has done quite substantial work on this topic, and this was also referenced in our report and in the European Parliament's report. So can you tell us about the significance of better interconnections and share your reaction to the study, please?
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Indeed, I'll talk a bit about the significance of better interconnections for the energy transition. And to start with, I'll start with a number. That is, the yearly benefits from interconnecting European electricity markets is 34 billion euros per year. So if we had isolated national markets tomorrow, we would lose 34 billion euros per year. And quoting the report by Enrico Letta on the single energy market, the larger the share of renewables, the larger the benefits from integration. So it's not because we're building very decentralized renewables in many corners that the benefits of the European energy markets disappear. It's quite the opposite. But now, how do we address that? And I'll describe a bit what do we understand with better interconnections, and then what can we deliver with that? Better interconnections start with better planning, as you mentioned. Clearly, if we had, for example, more clarity upstream about when and where renewables will be built or electrification will take place, that would reduce the risk in terms of investing in grids, including cross-border. There is also a question on transparency of planning. ACER's latest monitoring report only looked at 15% of all grid investments. So we don't have that overall visibility that enables us to assess what are the best practices, what are really the challenges, and how we can address them. The second element is better investments, clearly. We need to look beyond the wires. We need to look at so-called innovative grid technologies that can provide cheaper and faster alternatives to deliver the cross-border capacity we need. We don't necessarily need new lines, we need new capacity. In this respect, I very much agree on the challenges related to cost sharing. I feel the report brings a number of interesting ideas. I'm curious to see how discussions would go, in particular with respect to how to ensure that member states would feel comfortable paying for investments abroad. And in this respect, we see cost sharing as deeply linked with joint planning, because member states will only pay for network abroad if they trust that what their neighbors build is efficient and really brings them benefits. In this respect, I'd also add that we don't see EU funding as a silver bullet. We see it as a way to ease some kinds of agreements, but given the massive amounts we're talking about, we see it as unlikely that they will really solve the whole issue, or we would really need a sea change in the way we collect EU funds for that. And finally, better interconnections also means getting more capacity out of our existing lines. You already mentioned the minimum 70% target. Here we see significant room for improvement. And you also started mentioning network tariffs. We see a need for network tariffs to send better signals to consumers so that we can have more flexible consumption and therefore make the most of existing lines. And so if we have better planning, better investment, and if we manage to get more capacity out of our existing lines, we would really get better interconnections. We would deliver cheaper energy prices. We would also dampen price volatility that occurs usually a few hours per day, for example, in Southeastern Europe. We would also increase resilience to shocks, as was shown in the French system in 2022 when we had widespread nuclear outages. And I would finish with that, I think we would really need stability, wider competition, and trust in the energy market. In the end, underlying that discussion,
I think we're having some trouble with the connection here.
Into this. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we lost you for a second.
Okay.
But there you are.
So I'll just close to say one key question beyond the economics is the politics. And as highlighted in the previous intervention, whether there is political willingness to go into more interconnections and a more integrated EU energy market with the related benefits.
Very interesting points. Thank you very much, Francois. And I'd love to pick up on your question later about member states investing abroad. Really a key question. I would like to first turn, however, to the grid operators in this group here. We have Enrico Maria Calini with us. You're the head of power system planning and permitting at Terna, and decades of experience on one hand, and you also hold the responsibility for interconnector projects at your company. So what are the aspects of the report that resonate most strongly with you? Please unmute yourself. Don't do the same as I did earlier. No, we cannot hear you.
You hear me now?
Now we hear you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you again. So from our side, the report clearly highlights many of the key challenges that we at Terna face in the development of the cross-border infrastructure. What resonates most is the call for improved coordination between infrastructure development, both nationally and across border, and the need to anchor such planning in consolidated scenario and EU-level policy objectives. So in our experience, the main barriers are often not technical, but for instance, fragmented governance or misaligned timelines and so on. And this is particularly critical for the transmission system operators that are expected to significantly scale up their investment to support Europe's climate and energy goal for the 2030, 40, and 50. So delivering this transformation requires broad, timely, and sustainable access to capital, supported by, let's say, predictable and forward-looking regulatory framework that provide fair and competitive returns. So a key topic gaining relevance in this context is how to fairly allocate project cost, especially for large capital-intensive cross-border asset. This is particularly true for the HVDC system, which are often the only viable solution in submarine projects. At Terna, we are invested in a lot of HVDC projects, including the interconnection with Montenegro, Greece, Tunisia, and Corsica in the Mediterranean Sea, but also a lot of new internal HVDC projects to integrate high volume of renewable sources. So at EU level, the discussion is moving towards a new cost-sharing mechanism for a hybrid offshore infrastructure. However, in a technological neutral approach, I think that a similar consideration apply to any infrastructure aimed at integrating renewables into the European system. So we believe that evolving regulatory framework must be capable to accommodating hybrid asset, share ownership models, and dynamic access rules, but always in a way that reflects the specific challenges and conditions faced by each member state and TSO. So concluding in a short, for our point of view, the report captures many of practical challenges that we deal with daily, from governance to digitalization, and the need for tailored support to strategic infrastructure. So as Italy, as a TSOs, we are fully committed to play a role as a bridge between Europe, Balkans, and the Mediterranean area. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrico. And I think it's good that you pointed out again, we're dealing here with an evolving system, and that, of course, requires an evolving regulatory framework and perhaps a more dynamic regulatory framework, which is also at the core of our work here at CERRE. I'm turning now to your colleague from RTE in France, Maurice Direc. You too bring decades of experience in the energy system and system management. Now you manage European affairs at RTE. What is your reaction to the report?
Thank you, Annika. So first and foremost, I think it's an excellent report, very interesting ideas in it. And as you said earlier, I hope they will also be of interest and of influence to the Commission in the upcoming work on the grid package and perhaps on the white paper for deeper market integration thereafter. And if you look at the elephant in the room, it has been alluded to by a number of people already. But I think it's a lot bigger than people think, and that is that we're trying to reach climate goals through decarbonizing production of electricity, but demand for electricity is flat, and it has been flat for the last 20 years. And we are not going to be successful if we start building lots of infrastructure for demand that is not there. So we have to integrate that whole aspect of how do you also increase demand for all the renewables production capacity that is going to be installed, and how do you do that in a coordinated way so that you have the right production capacities at the right location, and then you can build the right infrastructure that takes that energy to where it's actually required. And I would also agree with what Francois said. It's not just a question of building additional infrastructure, it's also a question about what can we do to make better use of the existing infrastructure. And I would hope that that would be a big part of the discussion going forward. Then moving on from that, and unfortunately having to agree again with the authors, which is not my usual posture in this discussion, I very much agree that regional planning is going to be very important. I think it is the missing link, a voluntary improved regional coordination between member states to agree on what their generation setup is going to be, how much of it there will be, and how reliable the plans from the countries in these regions are going to be, so that there is trust to do the cross-border investments that will be necessary. Then if you look at another aspect of the whole infrastructure discussion, I think we all know that infrastructure unfortunately does not get built in one day. We've had some experiences of projects lasting up to 35 years. And I think we will also need to find a mechanism to integrate that reality into our thinking on how we set targets, not just for volumes, but also for timelines. And if you look at our current infrastructure here in Europe, it was built over 150 years. And we would like to build basically a completely new system in the next 15 years, which somehow seems optimistic. Let's put it that way. And I think it would be really helpful for all of us if we could put that back into how we think about targets and how we think about timelines. I think Bruno mentioned the 15% interconnection target, and that Spain at the moment is at a very low level. It was actually at a much higher level a few years ago, but their capacity, their generation capacity increased so much that mathematically your level of interconnection is going to go down, which tells me that the target is not right. It's not flexible enough. It does not take into consideration the dynamics of the market, of the economy. And I think it would be really helpful moving forward if we could also get that sort of thinking in our European discussions about saying, if we are going to fix targets, can we make these targets dynamic? It's not just a regulation that has to give some room for experiments and for learning as we go. It is also the entire regulatory setup, which sometimes, with the best of intentions, that's not the discussion here, but gets into a framework that is too rigid for what physical reality tells us. And then the last point I would like to make, and actually it's quite nice to be in this call with Enrico, because it's a little experience we shared a few years ago when we were both in system operations. The grid is not just an economic instance. It is a physical piece of hardware. It is critically important to the functioning of our modern societies, and we should be very careful that we do not let only economics drive our consideration of this critical piece of infrastructure. And what you get when you have a large interconnected grid is that you can also have large interconnected problems. And I remember a few years back, about 7:15 in the evening, I was in the control room. And we had a problem because due to an IT issue, the cross-border capacity had been allocated twice, which means that all of a sudden you have physical flows which are not in line with what the system is designed to handle. And I had to call Enrico and ask him, well, how are we going to solve this? We did find a solution, but there is this physical reality that we need to keep into consideration, and where we also need to be sure that whatever extensions we do and whatever capacity optimizations we do maintain system security at the physical level at all times. Thank you.
Thanks for this fascinating insight in the practical work, actually, of managing cross-border connections, Maurice. And I would like to turn now to our regulators here on the panel. I think you've gone right into the painful questions, Maurice, and perhaps we can get a response. Turning first to Jody O'Boyle. Jody, hi. You are the networks manager and electricity lead at the utility regulator of Northern Ireland, and already due to your geographical position, I think interconnectors are a key focus for you. What are useful takeaways from today's discussion, the study, and I mean, even if you operate under slightly different regulatory frameworks, I'm sure there are things that you share. Please.
No, thanks for that. Congratulations on a great report that highlights a lot of the issues that need to be discussed to enable future investment in cross-border infrastructure. Interconnectors are very important, particularly for the island of Ireland. We operate 2 different jurisdictions here, Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland, and therefore operate an all-island system. So that interconnection makes the all-island system more resilient and efficient by connecting neighbouring grids. So on Ireland, we have a number, Moyle, East-West interconnector, the Celtic interconnector, and Green Line. Others are in the development pipeline. We have Lyric in Northern Ireland and Mars Connect in the Republic of Ireland. Now we also have a tie line between the north and south that's in development. We call that the north-south interconnector. While it's not necessarily a true interconnector, it's a tie line. But that has led to its own problems. It's had FOIs, EIRs, planning appeals, judicial reviews. And to try and alleviate these appeals, it's very important that all parties have a well-defined roles in developing these infrastructure. So roles of the system operators, the regulator, the government departments, all influence the economic, financial and technical aspects of additional interconnection. So these projects, they all need to be technically feasible, financially viable, and have benefits to each member state and its people. So how these infrastructures are financed, be that via a merchant-funded or via a mutualised state company, or even via a cost risk share between state asset owners, no matter what funding model, all will need guarantees, be that like a CFD or other mechanisms to ensure that they're financially viable. And the cost risk share is proportionate between the member states and provides also a reasonable return on investment. Now, you'll have a lot of inputs into that, such as access rights, use of system, congestion, revenues, rents, compensation. Those will all be very important indicators, to judge the financial attractiveness of the project. But different member states need to be able to have the ability to agree those congestion, revenues and rents between different jurisdictions. One of the issues that we're seeing is that different member states will have different legal and regulatory frameworks. And depending on the member states' climate strategies and action plans, the legislative framework between member states can be misaligned. So this essentially can frustrate the financial close of a cross-border infrastructure project. And therefore, member states, government departments and regulators need to step up enable that the framework to facilitate these developments. Otherwise, a lot of these cross-border infrastructures won't get off the ground. Essentially, we'll need to align things like your 10-year development plan or grid package. We need to ensure that we're updating both the legal and regulatory framework between member states so that they're aligned to the same timing and they can operate under the same program. So it's very important to get these activities all lined up so that each member state knows what they're doing, so these interconnectors can operate at full capacity.
Thank you, Jody. I mean, very interesting. I think you're pointing, you're showing great openness towards a number of instruments, but also you point at similar issues that we heard before. There is definitely a question around the planning and the visibility of what's happening around you. Now, your neighbor, Gavin Knott, you are with us from Ofgem.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hi, good to see you. I'm really glad that we're also working with you a lot. I mean, the UK's interconnectors are mostly with the EU. It would be, of course, also interesting to hear your perspectives and how, an expansion of interconnector capacity links in with wider market developments from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much. So it's been really interesting report, and I've been thinking a lot about some of the proposals about how things could work. I mean, obviously, our situation in terms of how pricing works is to some degree evolving. As people probably know, we have a trade and cooperation agreement with the EU, which I think probably covers certainly the majority of our interconnectors, and there is, I think there is the potential for that to continue to develop over time in terms of the detailed pricing that is used. So, I think it's a really interesting time to see a report on, approaches that could be followed in terms of how different pricing might work. I mean, what I was going to touch on briefly was so some of the points which I think have come out in previous presentations, but so our approach to interconnectors, we have had, as GB a view that, there should be more interconnectors, and there was a target to increase the level of interconnection. And linked to that, we opened what we called a window for review of the approach to the regulatory regime for interconnectors. So effectively, most of the interconnectors that we have are subject to a regulatory regime with a cap and floor, which effectively links the returns for investors to the amount of the amount that goes through the interconnectors, with protection for investors and protection for consumers. But in evaluating that, it is quite difficult because of the amount of uncertainties and changes that are expected over the period. So we're looking at projects where they may come into operation in the early 2030s. And, we are sort of very much looking at the moment at wholesale market reform. So decisions are intended to be made soon on the approach to how and if we reform our own wholesale market arrangements, so the introduction of locational pricing or reforms to national pricing. And ultimately, we're also looking at loads of really big decisions around planning just within our own GB territory around sort of where we build future generation, how much network we build. So as we look to electrify the system, we're looking at very large potential investments. And all of these kind of change the economics of some of the interconnectors, and the extent to which new interconnection might actually, in some ways increase constraints on the system if ultimately you have a pricing structure, which means that they, I think probably flow the wrong way is the kind of the simple way of putting it. And so, we've had a lot of challenges in looking at sort of in the context of an evolving system, both in terms of how interconnectors are priced and also how markets work on both sides, and also the nature of the networks. I think, it's the uncertainties here are significant. And I think, the discussions that we're having here about cost allocation, I think actually, there are going to be similar issues, I imagine, sort of in many of the member states that are looking at potential interconnection and most efficient approaches going forward. And I can only say from our own review of the recent proposals for interconnectors, then changing assumptions about what's going to happen in sort of 5-10 years time can have a significant effect on the economics of some of the interconnectors, and happy to go into more detail on some of those points if helpful, but also really interested in discussing further the wider points made about how we set an efficient longer term charging structure.
Thanks a lot, Gavin, for bringing up the importance of the market design actually for interconnectors. And we're, of course, keenly looking forward to the decisions coming out of the UK soon. I wonder if some of the panelists want to come in here and react. If do we need to touch the bidding zones? Do we need to touch the market design to get this topic off the ground? Bruno, you're laughing, but do you want to come in?
Well, when I hear market design and bidding zones on top of grid planning, I think we're going to spend the rest of the day here and probably next month as well. But maybe let me start by reacting to a few of the remarks of the other panelists. I think that there's a number of things that we need to identify as factors that we do control and that we do not control yet. When it comes to for example, the hybrid interconnectors and the offshore connections, we have a little bit. I'm Belgian, for those that don't know, so we have a little bit of experience on with that and with issues on that. Part of the problem is, of course, that right now we are not only talking about difficult to judge evolutions when it comes to production volumes and to electrification volumes, but also there's a huge amount of restrictions in the supply chain. When it comes to HVDC, for example, there's a huge issue of limited supply, limited number of suppliers, and so very hard to control costs, which will all be reflected in the investment price, obviously, and which will create a big difficulty in allocating the costs, even if you have to spread them over a region. So I think we need to find a good balance between how do we support the whole supply chain through visibility of investments. And for that, I do think, I'm sorry, Mauricio, I do think you need not too flexible binding targets, so that you kind of know where the production and the demand will be for materials, and you can scale up the production, because otherwise that is simply not going to happen. So I think that's one big thing. I didn't react to the proposals or the issue on regional allocation of the costs and regional cooperation. I think, again, sea basins, whether it is the North Sea or the Baltic, or even North Sea and Baltic, are very good examples of potential regional cooperation. But there's a big but. The more you have different partners, the more potential you have for asymmetric benefits, of course. And I think we do need, and I'm not sure if the report that you're proposing today has already figured that out. We do need to find a way to make sure that we place the bar for equal benefits or shared benefits as high as possible, so that we limit the parts of the asymmetry. Because the more asymmetric you make the benefits, the harder it is going to be to justify the cost allocation. If you do it at a regional level, it should be done in such a way that the mutual benefit, the shared benefit, the equal benefit is as high as possible of the investment that you're going to make. Because otherwise you're going to make a very, very, very complicated scenario for allocating the costs. I don't know if anybody wants to react on that one, but I think that's an issue that we really have. I'm a great believer in the idea of going towards net benefit cost sharing. But the harder you make it to calculate the net benefit, the more difficult it is going to be political. And that's me as a politician speaking now. If you have to explain to the citizens in your own country that they're going to be putting up for 80% of the cost of a connection, and the other country that is going to at the same time sell us the electricity is only going to pay for 20% of that, we're going to have issues. Political issues, not maybe economical issues, but serious political issues. Just pointing that out to make things simple.
Anyone wants to react directly?
I'm always happy to be cited by name, so I'll react to the target discussion, which is a good one. If you look about targets, I'll use something from a completely different area. Pensions. I can have a defined benefit pension or a defined contribution pension. In both cases, I have a target. The first one is economically impossible. The second is the only one which will work over the longer term. If you use that in the energy world, and especially when you look at the fact that countries or member states are sovereign in the choice of energy mix, if country A decides to put in, for argument's sake, 1,000 gigawatts of intermittent resources, and country B wants 200 gigawatts of baseload resources. If I apply the 15% target, the one country on the one side of the border should have 150 gigawatts of interconnectors, and the other one should have 30. So that somehow just doesn't work, which is why I think these targets need to be reconsidered and need to be looked at from a much more systemic and regional perspective. So, but I'll leave it at that.
If I may also comment on those targets, and if my connection is working.
Yes, we hear you well.
Good. Indeed, there is a question on how you define those targets, and it, as highlighted, it can be very difficult to have a robust target, especially if you want it simple and robust. What we would see potentially as more where we could trigger progress is how would we really have delivery of those beneficial projects? Because beyond discussing whether Spain to France is 3%, 15%, or what should be, we see that there could be very significant benefits in increasing the cross-border capacity. This is where we see the discussion should go. Do we have benefits? And then how can we unlock the deployment? And do we need a soft push, more coordination at regional or EU level in order to deploy that?
Yeah, you're alluding again to the governance of those cross-border connections also, and the authors have suggested a layered approach and to tackle projects according to their complexity and according, I guess, to the risks and benefits. The costs and benefits at the EU level, at the regional level, or at a bilateral level. What do you think about that?
I guess the question's for me, or
anyone. It's open round. Enrico, do you want to come in?
Yes. The cost allocation. Our point of view is that the default approach should remain voluntary negotiation among the hosting countries, with the flexibility to define project-specific arrangement that reflects each country's grid development plan, regulatory structure, and bilateral energy strategy. So this model has worked in practice. For example, in Italy, we have Italy-Tunisia interconnector, but also with the interconnection with the Corsica. So it's work very well. So that said, when projects show clear European added value, but are not financially viable for the hosting countries alone, we support the use of targeted alternatives, such as dedicated EU funding instruments. However, I think that such tool should be based on a robust and harmonized cost-benefit analysis and used selectively to avoid distortion in the investment. And another important point for us that we support refining the CBCA instruments to capture a broader set of benefits, including a contribution to the renewable integration, grid flexibility, resilience, and strategic autonomy, and so on. But these require, in our view, a better modeling, more reliable, and the possibility to adjust the CBCA allocation at the later stage once a project assumptions are more consolidated and close to realization. So additionally, we think that the proposal to involve non-hosting countries in cost sharing may be appropriate in specific cases, especially when the hosting TSO cannot recover the full cost despite the broader EU benefits. However, we believe that the EU grants are generally preferable and enforceable in cost-sharing obligation in such situation. This is our point of view. Thank you.
You're alluding to a point in the report, which is also to give the cost-benefit analysis a more central role instead of just informing projects of common interest, to give it a really central role in the TYNDP process. Do you think that would be beneficial? I have a very shy panel here. Maybe, I can also take questions from the Q&A. Or François, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I can. Maybe on this question, indeed, we find the bilateral cost sharing probably less and less fit for purpose if we go towards the future, especially in a meshed network where benefits may be spread more and more broadly. We also see that in some cases, agreeing on those cost-benefit sharing takes a long time, and every time you come with a new project, you have to come with a new agreement. I've even heard a member state saying the bilateral cost sharing is impossible because it's so time-consuming, so complicated. And even sometimes when the costs change, then you have to reopen the whole negotiation. What we see as regulators is we see a need to have a holistic discussion on how we share the costs of infrastructure. So I'm going to make the problem even more complex, I'm afraid, because you could argue it's not only about CBCA, so cost-benefit cost allocation, but there is a question about inter-TSO compensation and congestion income, as you raised. So we probably need to have that economic discussion, always keeping in the background, and I see that Bruno would come in, the political discussion that I think is even bigger, because we can probably have an economic discussion on indeed benefit-based. The question is, will politicians be ready to commit for the next 20 years to pay 10% of an interconnector in another country? And will they trust that it will remain like that when a new government is elected in their country? That's it.
Bruno, please come in.
That goes back to the whole discussion on the energy mix. I mean, you cannot have all countries in the EU being net exporters of electricity. It just doesn't work. And unless and until we get a good political discussion to solve that issue, we will not get to improve planning of interconnectors, and we will never solve the benefits and the cost sharing issue.
Well, at the risk of being blamed for being shy, so I'll come in. I think there's a lot of valid points being raised, but since Maurice likes to be provocative and get a response, in a previous life I've been the Minister for Pensions, and I can say that defined contribution pensions, at least in Europe, only ever work if there's a joint system where the governments provide a backstop or at least a minimum state pension that is at a guaranteed level. And so maybe it's a nice analogy because I think if you keep the interconnection discussion bilateral between every time two countries, you're going to miss more and more of joint benefits, and more importantly, you're going to create situations whereby the lack of an agreement between two different countries is going to have a very negative impact on 3-4 other countries in Europe in an integrated market. Because the more you need, the more you integrate. I think somebody referred to the Letta report. The larger the share of renewables becomes, the more important the need for interconnections becomes, and the bigger you want the effect of the positive price effect of renewables on the electricity bills, the more interconnections you need. And so you cannot keep that dependent on an agreement between two countries, depending on their specific national economic and infrastructural situations. But I do think there's the other option that is being raised in the report of a cost sharing with that is conditional on a contribution from EU funding, might create a way out of that, because there is many situations where there is a gap in potential benefits if it's only related to two countries, neighboring countries, that could be covered by European funding that corresponds to the benefit that goes broader or beyond those two individual countries. And examples are there's plenty of examples in Europe. Interconnection between Austria, for example, and Eastern Europe, where there is a big issue. The whole discussion going on between Sweden and Germany in the Baltic, where there is a huge co-benefit potential, but a very big difficulty of finding agreement on the costs. I think we need to look at it broader and examine the different possible scenarios for those backstops, where you can have defined contributions, but yes, there's also a guarantee to make sure that there is some funding for the social benefit. And yeah, the analogy with the pension system is very interesting because maybe only because I recognize it a little bit. So thank you, Maurice, for that.
Thank you, and I would agree with you. I mean, I didn't think about that analogy, and I'm by no means a pension expert, but it does go into the direction of discussions that we've been having, which I think also align with what Francois was saying, that you cannot have European money funding everything, but there could be European money that either provides a base level so that you don't have a residual risk, or that could cover the remaining costs in case you would build an infrastructure that then does not serve its intended purpose, so that you have at least some minimum guarantee that you get your operating costs covered for, and that you're not stuck with an asset that's just sitting there in the landscape.
So, can I just chip in? Just, I mean, largely to just say that was a really interesting discussion. I largely agreed with an awful lot of it. I mean, it all indicated, you know, I mean, I guess we have had very much a kind of what you might call a case-by-case approach, and effectively the fact that you're going to have a number of areas of interconnection, and actually with other kind of a sort of missing effectively market failures or gaps, where you do need to step in and identify a way to fix it, to ensure investment with social benefit. And obviously the more that you're looking across countries, then that becomes more complex, but generally we have mechanisms to do it. But effectively that you often don't necessarily need a one size fits all. There are particular big areas, there may be particularly large risk areas where there is a priority for these kind of wider benefits assessment, and that if that is difficult to negotiate and it is complex, then actually you may not need to do it every time, because there are probably a lot of areas where a simpler approach would still work.
Jody, please come in.
Hi. Different member states will have different measurements of, low carbon renewable targets. Some countries have a percentage of how much is generated. Some have a percentage of how much is consumed. Unless there's agreement between like cross-border flows, there will be winners and losers. And ultimately, it'll be the member state citizens who'll have to pay for any imbalances. So there does need to be a coordinated discussion on targets, and that needs to be at EU political level to try and come together. And once that political level agreement is there, then there needs to be a plan of action in terms of legislative timelines so that each member state can implement whatever coordinated target or legislative legal framework that enables regulators to implement the policy. So there is a timing issue in terms of legislation, but ultimately it has to come from a discussion at EU political level.
Now, a lot of you mentioned this question of alignment between policy and political ambition and the reality on the ground, and also the planning processes that lack clarity and visibility beyond borders, but also in the time frame. So if you could maybe as a closing round, and then I take the questions from the audience, they're not overlooked, I'll take them to the academics. Perhaps we could just do a last round on the planning bit and think about what could be the maybe 1-2 elements that you would like to give in the hands of the Commission for the upcoming grid package, and say, okay, this would be an element that would really help, getting all these interconnectors off the ground. Is it a simpler planning structure, better coordination, new mandates, redefinition of roles? What would be on your mind? Jody, you want to start? Or is that an old hand?
I'm happy to start. Whoever wants to go.
Okay.
Jody, over to you.
All right. Okay. I'd like to see more of a joint government policy support where you have similar legislative timelines across member states. Member states should all have the same aims, objectives, and the legal framework needs to be in place for the regulators to implement the policy. National regulators can't operate outside their legal boundaries, otherwise they'll be at risk of judicial review. So the legislative framework needs to follow the policy framework. Ultimately, we need to ramp up investment in the grid, grid expansion. We need to ramp up investment in digitalization. We need to ramp up investment in flexibility. Otherwise, there's going to be lots of connection delays and those will increase. We effectively just need to get on with it and get infrastructure built. I am quite optimistic, and I'm hoping it's a bit like the baseball movie, The Field of Dreams, kind of build it and they will come. So I'm really optimistic about the future, and I hope that the direction that we're all heading means that the government support and the legislative timeline enables the regulators to be able to do their job.
Thanks, Jody. Who's sharing Jody's optimism here?
Yeah, well, I share the optimism, but I do think there's a few issues we still need to tackle, and there's one that hasn't been mentioned, and that is we've been talking a lot of cost allocation between TSOs and member states, but we're talking very little about the reflection of those costs in people's or consumers' bills. And I think that's an essential thing to tackle, because necessarily build it and they will come. They probably will, maybe not tomorrow, but the problem is they may come the day after tomorrow or next month. But they will start paying tomorrow. And if we're talking about anticipatory investments, and some of them will be anticipatory investments in the grids, we need to find a way to make sure that we don't reflect them immediately in consumers' bills, because otherwise you will get an imbalance between the rise of grid costs and grid fees in electricity bills on the one hand, and a decrease in electricity prices, which we are expecting and which is supposed to come on the other hand. you will break that parallel. And so you need something to cushion the impact on electricity bills of the grid investments in the short term, until you can get the equalization of decreasing commodity costs versus increasing infrastructure costs, because they will to some point balance each other out. But when you start investing, the balance gets lost because you start paying first before you get the benefits. I think that's something the Commission needs to really address.
That's a really important point. Thanks for bringing that up. And the Commission, the study also has a number of case studies on different ways of from full cost socialization to actually sharing between the actors and so on. So you can find that in there. Very quick reactions still from the round, and then I would like to give the word back to the researchers.
I can add left. Then quickly.
Yes,
well, before changing, we really need to implement what we already introduced in legislation. We have many things in legislation that will help us, but that we haven't implemented yet. So we need to address those delays. And then if we were to add something, there is the question of reviewing cost sharing cross-border holistically. I don't know if it's realistic to hope that the Commission would have a proposal on how to share cost, or whether that would be a process to lead to that. But we see that as a major roadblock.
Gavin?
Sorry, unmuting. Yeah, we're not a member state, so I don't know if we can really help to answer this question. But just to say, I think we are also interested in. I mean, I think we found planning seems to be working okay from our side. So it's interesting if there's sort of big areas where it's not necessarily working. But in terms of pricing, we definitely think there is an ongoing need, and I think we've said that we're looking at ongoing how we make the pricing work effectively for both sides of the interconnector, given and how we come up with future arrangements which are sort of long-term efficient and reduce the risk of inefficient uses of our own interconnectors going forward.
Thanks. Final words from Enrico and Maurice?
Yes. From my point of view, in terms of planning coordination, I believe that the current coordination between the European level, the TINDP of ENSOE, and the National Development Plan is quite adequate. However, we think that one persistent challenge is the timely and stable definition of system needs, which can be affected by evolving input and policy adjustment, especially in case of renewables, rapid and sometimes unpredictable developments driven by auction, market signal, or permitting timelines can shift priorities and in the short term. So this fluctuation should be addressed primarily at the national level with mechanism to stabilize the reference scenario used in planning for a better coordination in planning. Thank you.
Thank you. And Maurice, you have the last word from the panel.
Okay. My point is just that whole planning process is physically not a simple process, and it's not going to be any simpler by changing the governance. So people should not make any illusions about how good it will all be if somebody else starts doing the process. You still will have to go all the way down to the distribution level, system level, and then integrate upwards. And I'm not even talking about cross-sector planning. So it's just complicated, and it would be good if people bear that in mind.
Okay, thanks very much. And now Bert and Christine, I would like to bring you back and see if you have reactions to the panel. There's also a question from the audience about, better coordination of the development of interconnections between member states. How could this be done from a supranational level?
Okay, I wrote some things down, but I will start with that. And then I didn't really read the question yet, so I will try to get some time to that. So I think it was a very interesting roundtable, and I enjoyed it quite a lot. So I hope that also the audience liked it. So I think what's nice that we see it's engineering, legal, economics, and politics. So there are all those aspects that come together. And I wanted to highlight some ideas. So I think that solidarity is something that we discussed in the report. So I think that that's one of the key issues. So EU funds, they could be used to pay for some of those broader public goods. But I think that also the binding interconnection targets that Bruno was talking about, that this might actually help to create to align all the preferences within the EU, and I think that's actually going to help to reduce the amount of bargaining that member states are going to make. But in the report, we also argue that the current targets don't make much sense. They're not really economics based, and we might need to go for different types of targets. And the way that we think about this regional coordination is to actually make sure that we get more of the solidarity, because we can discuss energy development of offshore wind, let's say, together with the infrastructure, and we can discuss multiple projects together. And it's what theory shows, it's easier to come to an agreement if you discuss multiple projects together. So that's about solidarity that we shouldn't forget. I think we also see that there is kind of a link between regulation. So we think that there is some flexibility in regulation that we don't completely use yet. So it could go about co-ownership of assets to reallocate risk. It could be about long-term transmission rights that also give some more guarantees. And I think one of the key issues there is that we have to think about the risk allocation. Who takes up the risk? Who takes up the risk of the increase of material cost? Is that the government, or should that be the TSO? And I think, yeah, that's kind of interesting. And some of this also means that we need to become more flexible in the way that we regulate, and that some of those assets need to be regulated in a different way than having everything on a regulated asset base, but that we have wider forms of regulation, and member states and the EU maybe have to widen up some of the regulation. So I think also something that we didn't discuss about, but that's the national energy and climate plans. So we might also think that that's another way of tackling this issue of trying to get more coordination. So some of the member states, their national energy and climate plans, they were not really up to standard. And I think CERRE has in the past argued for having a sort of an independent review of those national energy and climate plans, like we have like a energy poverty kind of review. Maybe we also want to kind of have some scrutiny on those plans, and maybe have like an independent expert committee that looks whether those plans actually make sense, and whether those are very useful in reaching those goals. I think I will leave it to Christine now, because I think she also has some other meetings to attend to.
Yeah, thanks. I think in the interest of time for everyone, I don't have much to add. Thank you very much for the interesting discussion and for the comments. Maybe I can pick up just one point that I think Bruno made. I don't know if he meant to make it, though, which is that there will be likely some kind of trade-off between projects that we can realize and that we can get people behind, and what is actually optimal. And then in the discussion moving forward, I think it will be very interesting and useful to understand what the trade-off is, and where we can all sort of agree to trade off, and where we want to go the extra mile, because this is complicated and difficult to actually get it right.
Okay, thanks a lot. We are over time, so I would like to close here and just remind everyone we are available. You can follow us on LinkedIn. You can subscribe to our newsletter. Next topics on our mind are resilience in all its forms as of the 7th of July. And we are also launching a really interesting report on data centers and their role in the energy system and the effect of AI on demand in Europe on the 30th of September. So stay tuned and have a lovely afternoon. And thank you to everyone involved to today's discussion. It was a pleasure.